2nd of July, 9:24 a.m. Almost silently, the door opened, while the man still kept on hitting the release button with his whole fist. Sweat was dripping off his pale face as he kept mumbling 2 words over and over again. Please, don't. It sounded like a prayer, which it somehow truly was. The panic in his voice gave it the necessary gravitas. 6 minutes had passed while he had hammered on the door, even tried to pry it open, but it hadn't moved. Not until now. Not until it was too late. He forced himself to stop staring at the button, but instead look into the small room. He didn't want to. Never before in his life had he ever wanted to run away this much. He knew. But he couldn't. Not right now. His legs were shaking as he forced himself to pull away from the button and almost staggered toward the open door. With his own screams still ringing in his ears, Norman couldn't even listen for the signs he was hoping for. Breathing. Another voice. Maybe even a cry. There was nothing but his own panicked breaths and the whimper coming from his throat. Please, don't. He could smell it in the air. The stench of his own sweat mixed with something else. Norman reached out to the corner of the open door and steadied himself as his eyes fell upon the body on the floor. 6 minutes. Far too long to survive. He could feel his knees giving in as he fell to the floor. She's dead, Vince, he whispered, then repeated those same words, only louder. The small radio on his wrist whirred softly. His partner's non-answer was filling the air. We killed her. He could feel the cold sweat now running down his skin, and he was still trembling. We need to call an ambulance. The police. Those words finally made his partner open his mouth. Don't, the gruff voice replied. Just get her into the lab. 2nd of July, 7:12 p.m. I shouldn't have let you do this, Norman whispered and glanced at the man standing next to him. Looking, just like him, through the window into the lab room. The atmosphere in here was oppressive, and he was pretty sure he knew exactly why. It was an accident. I told you again and again. There's no point in worrying now, Norm. The voice of his colleague grated on his nerves. This nonchalant tone almost made him explode. She had died. Annabelle, their assistant in this small lab. And now, instead of calling the police and an ambulance, they were about to experiment on her corpse. Like a bunch of maniacs. The names Burke and Hare came to his mind, and he almost bowled over. I don't care if it was an accident. Sooner or later, we will need to inform the authorities. Do you know how much trouble we'll be in once they find out what we did? His colleague only gave off a humorless chuckle, and Norman wanted to lunge at him again. "Are you afraid of a bit of corpse desecration?" He heard the man, and now had to grab hold of his arm so as to stop himself from punching him to the ground. The death might have been an accident, but soon someone would realize that Annabelle had gone missing. And once the police turned up here, well, they would find her corpse strapped to machines with a whole cocktail of drugs pumped into her lifeless body. The lab would be shut down, as it should, and Vince and he would both end up in prison. "You worry too much," his colleague suddenly piped up, putting a hand on her shoulder, which Norman immediately pushed off. "It's not like we would have a great future ahead of us anyway. The lab's been running on fumes for half a year already. Without any great breakthrough, we'd be done for. How about we go out in a blaze of glory?" Norman felt a stinging pain in his chest at these words. Was that the first sign of a heart attack? His whole body felt like it was getting pricked by needles, and the cold sweat just wouldn't abate. He couldn't shake the memory of that accident. Since he had been the one to send Annabelle into the server room, he felt responsible for her death. Even if it wasn't his fault, as some part of him liked to remind himself. It had been just that, an accident. The server room's emergency protocol to extinguish any kind of fire was to seal the doors shut and flood the whole room with nitrogen. There had to have been some kind of spark in there or something, Norman told himself again. Something had happened which had set off the sensors. For 6 minutes, Annabelle had been in there, all alone, with no air left to breathe. She had died suffocating, completely on her own. Norman felt himself getting sick again, and the tremors in his arms and legs increasing. Vince, standing next to him, seemed fine in comparison. Yeah, he was fidgeting around, shifting his gaze from the screen to the window every few minutes. But that was normal for him. He had looked almost the same back when they had started. If the police turned up here, would he be able to blame it all on Vince? There definitely was something up with him. At first, when the door to the server room got sealed, he didn't act at all. But as soon as it opened, he had been the one to order him around. He had told him where to put the body, with a list of drugs to pump into her already at hand. Norman looked up again and through the glass pane. Annabelle was lying there, on the table, with myriads of tubes running into and out of her. He felt sick. "Just remember what we did with the frog," Vince told him again, and Norman could see that his colleague was smiling softly. Yeah, the frog. Their one and only halfway successful experiment, and the one they couldn't publish due to unscientific parameters. But it had worked. They had managed to reanimate it, if only for a short time. Norman bristled at the memory, then shot his colleague a glance. "If I find out that the accident wasn't an accident, I will make sure you'll never see daylight again," he whispered, and immediately could see Vince smiling brightly at his side. The man seemed completely unperturbed. He didn't even look the least bit guilty. Instead of answering, Vince stared down at the screen for a few seconds, then raised his head once more. I think we're getting close to the necessary concentrations. What do you say? Ready for the first day of our new lives? Norman watched helplessly as the man by his side pressed a key, and heard the machines in the other room starting to whir. A single drop of cold sweat dripped from his chin and onto his shirt. Something bad was about to happen. 2nd of July, 9:14 p.m. Norman could feel the tremors through the soles of his shoes. They were rhythmic, like a heartbeat, and getting faster with every passing moment. From time to time, he glanced over at the screen of his partner's laptop and watched the numbers. It looked promising, he knew, but didn't feel any relief. On the contrary, with every passing moment, he felt worse and worse about the whole thing. What were they doing here? Their assistant had died 12 hours ago, and they hadn't informed anyone. Neither the police, nor her family or friends, if she even had them. All they were doing right now was using her body for an unsanctioned experiment. One they wouldn't even be able to publish if it succeeded. He was feeling sick to his stomach, which was made even worse by the sound of his colleagues whistling in the hallway outside. Did the man have no conscience at all? What would they do once the police arrived here? Because no matter what they did, the authorities would need to get involved one way or another. Norman bristled at the thought and almost threw up all over his shoes. This was madness. Complete and utter insanity. But the machines in the other room were whirring and shaking softly, pumping more sludge into the lifeless body, while electrodes glowed and fell dark again in the rhythm of a heart. The whistling outside stopped, and the door behind Norman opened suddenly, which made him jump. Everything okay here? He heard his colleague's almost giddy voice. His behavior made it all so much worse. It felt like the man was drawing him into his insanity. He didn't turn around to look at Vince as the man entered the room, then reached a notebook and let out an approving whistle. Apparently, everything was going according to his plan. Norman wasn't sure if he liked it or not. Shouldn't be long now, right? He heard his colleague's voice, and a new shiver ran through his bones. If it happens at all, Norman couldn't help but say. There was no way in hell what they were doing now could ever be considered ethical or even legal. If it worked, they would still get blacklisted and might end up in prison. His colleague seemed to read his thoughts in that regard, though. If she wakes up again, we will publish it, the man said, and Norman almost choked as he shot around. He was staring daggers at the grinning fool standing in front of the notebook. But his colleague didn't even seem to notice it again. If it works, we're made men. There are so many people out there, rich ones, powerful ones, who would literally kill to have us work for them. Can you even imagine it? They'd pay off anyone who would try to lock us up. We'll be like gods. Norman could feel this cold chill again. His throat was completely closed up as he continued staring at the man standing there, wallowing in his fantasy. He wanted to say something, to dash those wild dreams, but just as he finally managed to get his voice back, another appeared. It was a single, drawn-out scream that echoed through the glass as the dead woman on the table suddenly sat up. 2nd of July, 9:48 p.m. Norman's hands were shaking, but now it was for a different reason. She was sitting there, looking around, breathing, blinking, shivering, all of it on her own. He couldn't believe it. His rational mind fought against the evidence he could see and hear. This wasn't supposed to happen, a part of him screamed. Yes, it had been their grand goal in all of this, but they had gone at it all wrong. Not even their groundwork had been finished yet. The frog they had reanimated had died shortly after, and they hadn't even started with mammals yet. So why? How? He looked over his shoulder and through the window at his colleague, who still sported this knowing smile. Vince had done something. Had he planned it all along? The accident and the reanimation protocol? When Norman had dragged the lifeless body in here, he had found the ingredients for the drug cocktail already easily available. Every single part of it was measured beforehand and arranged in the right order. Yeah, his conscience told him that his partner had done it, but right now he couldn't concentrate on that. What would the charges even be? It could hardly be murder if the person he had killed came back to life, right? Attempted murder? Norman shook his head and heard the woman cough softly. He could worry about everything else later, he promised himself, and forced his attention back to his patient. She seemed completely out of it for now. Her gaze was wandering through the room. She wasn't reacting to any noises or words. That could be a sign of brain damage, right? Norman pulled out a small flashlight again and shone it right into her eye. The pupil shrunk, and for a moment he could see her gaze focusing on him. A cold chill seemed to constrict his chest. Her eyes, they looked different. Not much, but they were a shade darker than before. She's just a bit under the weather. A sudden voice startled him, and as he looked back, he could see his colleague staring at him from the window. Give her an hour, and she'll be back to normal. Norman was shaking his head in response. His instincts warned him to keep on his toes. Something was wrong with her, they screamed. But as he concentrated on the woman again, he saw her smiling softly. Annabelle? He asked. Her eyes shot up to meet his. A reaction. A genuine one. Was Vince right again? Would she really get back to normal? Something inside him screamed at the thought. It was unnatural. Annabelle, can you hear me? He asked again, just like he had done dozens of times before. But this time, Norman thought he could see her smile, and not slightly. His body stepped back involuntarily as he noticed her doing it. Something about it irked him. It felt wrong, even though part of him wanted to scream and shout and rejoice. They had done it. And even better, Annabelle had come back to life. Her eyes were still on him, following him now as he slowly stepped to the side. She was smiling so warmly. It was kind of freaking him out. This was just a side effect from the drugs, he tried to tell himself. But something about the way she watched him reminded him of those nature documentaries he loved to binge. Like a predator looking at prey. Don't be ridiculous. Norman chided himself in his thoughts, stepped forward again, and extended a hand to touch her shoulder. She continued smiling and didn't move at all as fingers brushed her skin. Norman swallowed hard and tried to not let anything show on his face. The skin felt strangely cold and slightly sweaty. A sour stench was coming off her, stinging his nose now. Shit, he thought. Maybe they should drive her to the nearest hospital? Have them check her out? Norman turned his head and looked at his colleague, still watching from a safe distance. His smile was just as bright as Annabelle's. Only his betrayed his greed. He could see it in his eyes, this tiny spark. What had he gotten himself into? Those two were freaking him out right now. The demeanor, the looks, it all seemed off to him. You should try talking to her more. I'm gonna go out, get us some dinner, okay? Norman watched as the man already turned around before he could even mutter a reply and left him alone with Annabelle, who was still looking at him and smiling from ear to ear. 2nd of July, 10:26 p.m. Norman looked at the woman sitting in the chair in front of him, then let his head sink down for a moment to take a deep breath. Vince still wasn't back, but at least there hadn't been any emergency here either, so it wasn't like he really needed his partner right now. He had helped Annabelle wash up a bit, had redressed the small puncture wounds all over her skin, and clothed her in a shirt and pants that were 2 sizes too big for her, but at least decently clean. She still smiled at him, had done so throughout the whole procedure. Do you know where you are? He asked her, without looking up, and could see her feet tapping the floor softly. She still wasn't talking, but her mobility already seemed to get better. Right now, she was wriggling her toes, and as Norman looked up again, he could see her nodding as well. Do you know what day it is today? After a short pause, her head started to move from side to side. No. Norman tried smiling back at her, but could feel himself failing already. Do you remember what happened? The woman sitting across from him froze, and the grin on her lips seemed to vanish as she narrowed her eyes. Norman could feel the tension in the air suddenly increasing. Her lips were quivering, her mouth opened ever so slowly, and he could see her tongue shimmering in a dark, almost purple tone. He watched her jaw shifting, closing back up only to fall open again. It looked like a fish suffocating, or someone who hadn't spoken in years trying to form words. Norman was up and by her side in another moment, put a hand on her shoulder as she turned to face him. It's okay. he whispered, but the woman seemed determined to communicate with him. She was shaking. Her whole body was trembling. And this time, Norman saw something different in her eyes. Fear. Annabelle was looking up at him with this almost pleading stare, while her lower jaw worked tirelessly to try and make a sound. Was she remembering her death? This wasn't part of the plan. He screamed at himself in his mind while her fingers started softly clawing at his arms. Norman didn't know what he should do. This was exactly what he had tried to avoid. Her fingers found his shoulder, and suddenly Annabelle pulled him down until their heads almost collided. He could feel her breath on his cheek as he tried to push her off softly, but the woman was surprisingly strong. A sour stench filled his nostrils again. He heard her jaw clicking, then felt her breath on his skin once more. Cold, a dry voice whispered, almost inaudibly. Dark. The fingers suddenly left his shoulder, and he shot up, then stumbled backward. Her eyes still followed him, and in them he could see this pleading look. Norman was shivering now as well again. He could feel it, this strange shift in the atmosphere. Her dark eyes never left him, and he was so thankful as he heard the footfalls coming through the lab and toward them. 2nd of July, 11:43 p.m. Norman found himself in yet another room, one with 2 chairs, a table, 3 microphones, and a whole bunch of cameras. Vince's plan, he knew, but hadn't really been able to say anything against it. It wasn't bad, he told himself again. According to his partner, it was important that he be the one to take the lead in Annabelle's examination. The last thing they wanted to do was introduce more variables, and she had already formed a bit of a connection with him. Well, at least according to Vince, who was watching through the cameras to not disturb them too much. Norman sighed and looked at the woman across from him. Her movements were improving with every passing minute, it felt like. She was sitting there, relaxed and smiling, her fingers softly wandering over the cool and smooth top of the table. It was time to start, he thought, then gave one of the cameras a nod. "What is your name?" he asked, keeping his tone as professional as he could. 2 eyes focused even more on him. He could still see her jaw working a bit too much, but the voice that came out of her mouth felt at least similar to what she had sounded like before. "Annabelle." Norman gave her a slight smile and nodded at her, and focused again on the next question. "Where are we right now, Annabelle?" Her eyes narrowed for a moment, while her jaw opened and closed. "The lab." Again, he gave her a smile and a nod. She had been able to construct full sentences before, so Norman thought it might be okay to ask her a longer question. "Do you remember the accident? What happened?" Her eyes narrowed, but he couldn't concentrate on that. He was busy imagining what his colleague would think about that question. About what he would feel if she implicated him in her murder. A low groan escaped the woman as she slowly shook her head and then nodded. "I was in the room. The server room?" She nodded again, closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them. It reminded Norman of one of those strange dolls. "Server problem?" The woman groaned again and shook her head softly, but he didn't interrupt her. "Door shut. So cold. Dark. Air." Norman glanced at the camera. Her voice was getting rougher, as if it was painful for her. The thought of stopping her came to his mind. Something inside himself kept him from putting up a hand to halt her. He wanted to know what happened as well. "No air, no light, nothing. Then..." Another groan escaped the woman, and he could see her closing her eyes while a vein on her forehead appeared. It looked darker than it should, and stood in stark contrast to the skin around it. She was trembling in her seat and shaking her head. This wasn't going well. He could see it and feel it. The woman looked like she was teetering on the brink of a complete breakdown. Norman shot up from his seat and rounded the table. There was no point in going on. "Let her rest a bit." He suddenly heard Vince's voice coming through one of the speakers. Even his colleague thought the same. They could try again tomorrow morning. It wasn't like anyone here would leave until then anyway. 3rd of July, 3:13 a.m. Norman was tossing and turning on the uncomfortable couch in one of the normally unused rooms of the building. He couldn't sleep, yet felt too tired to get back up again. It was freaking him out still. After that interview, he had brought Annabelle to the next room over, had given her water and something to eat, then a blanket as he had led her to a far more comfortable sofa. She should be resting right now. At least, he hoped she did. What if she was dead again? What then? The police would bust down their doors. They would face the full brunt of their crimes. This had been a bad idea, Norman thought. A terrible one. He should never have followed Vince's lead. Now he was a co-conspirator. "Wait," he mumbled, as a sudden realization hit him. What if Vince had planned this all along? He hadn't even really interacted with Annabelle. Was he planning to make him the fall guy? No, that was impossible. He tried to calm himself and let his body relax again. There was no way Vince would get out of this on his own. If it went wrong, they would both go down. He tried to close his eyes to find some sleep, turned around once more, and suddenly felt wide awake. There was a distinctive smell in the air. Coppery. Then something moved in the corner of the room. A shape in the darkness. Norman blinked and raised his head. But it didn't disappear. Right between the border of the moonlight and the shadow of the corner, he could see something. Someone. The shape moved again, came another step closer, and Norman could feel his pulse speeding up. Annabelle. She was standing there, moving slowly from side to side. Something was wrong with her. "Annabelle?" he asked, and felt the tiredness get washed away by fear. The stench was stronger now. He wanted to put a hand in front of his nose to stop it, but every part of him warned him not to make any rash moves now. The shape took another step. Something glimmered in her hand. I couldn't make it out fully, but this shape reminded him of a tool he had worked with since his days in college. A scalpel. The figure took another slight step and finally came partially into the light. Norman scooted back on the couch. I think I remember now, a voice said. I could see it clearly now. The shirt she was wearing was drenched in blood. What happened? I was lying on the sofa. Because, I don't think I can sleep anymore. I started remembering. Annabelle was coming closer. Her voice sounded clearer than before. Her body was moving almost normally, but he could feel it in the air. This strange atmosphere. She pulled up her arm, and for a second, the moonlight got reflected on the blade of the scalpel. How long was I dead? Norman jumped from the couch and stepped back. He didn't like this situation. Not the conversation or her tone, and especially not that she was holding a scalpel in her hand. How long, Norm? He shook his head. She sounded so angry, and the knife in her hand was moving in the darkness around her head. It felt so threatening.
About 12 hours, I think,
he finally replied. A short laugh filled the small room. She had stopped moving just a step from the light. Her upper chest and face was still in the dark. 12 hours. It feels like a lifetime. You could hear this strange sadness in her voice and shivered. The room was pretty much empty. There was a window, but they were on the 3rd floor, and Annabelle was blocking the door. Norman felt his chest constricting. Another short laugh, followed by a sob, broke the silence between them. You could hear something dripping onto the cheap floor, and smelled the coppery stench of blood again. Annabelle laughed. Want me to tell you what happened back then? I mean, in the darkness? When I was dead? He couldn't even answer her. His throat was completely closed up. Where was his phone? If he didn't call someone right now. It's strange. I remember it so clearly now. Everything. From the door to the server room falling shut behind me. The sound of the pumps taking out the oxygen and replacing it. I remember how much I screamed for help. How I tried to claw at the vents. One of my nails broke. I remember that as well. The feeling of not getting air in your lungs is horrifying. My body started to cramp up as I tried to breathe, but simply couldn't. Around me, the lights seemed to be flickering as I slowly sank down and collapsed. I still remember my last thought. This can't be. Norman was shaking his head. She was getting more and more agitated. Maybe there had been brain damage. Maybe it was the drugs. But whatever it was, he didn't feel safe being in the same room with her now. Annabelle gave a short laugh again, then started talking once more. You know, I woke up what felt like only a second later. But it wasn't on the table in the lab, but on the floor of the server room. I was confused. I didn't know what had happened. The lights had gone out all around me. But I knew where I was because of that smell. So, with no idea what I was going to do, I started walking. Slowly at first, as I called out for help. But soon, I stopped caring. It took me a while to find the exit of the room in this pitch black and cold world. But time didn't really matter anymore. Then, as I stepped out, I felt it for the first time. Sharp, hot pain. Like something had torn out a piece of me. Norman watched the woman slowly move from side to side before the hand with the scalpel fell. Blood was dripping from its tip onto the floor. She was insane. Had she lost her mind completely? I started running, and whatever it was, it followed. Every few seconds I felt it again. A cut far deeper than I had ever thought possible. Pain that seemed to envelop my whole body. It was breathtaking. I cried and ran and tried to hide and fight back. But it didn't help. It made no difference. Sometimes it got me by the arm, other times the legs. Sometimes it even cut my face apart. It was staring at me every chance it got in a cold and dark place. But you know what? I started to like it. After years of running, I finally found the joy in it. This pain, the agony. I can't replicate it here. I've tried. Norman almost shrieked as she finally took another step forward and reached the light. She was grinning from ear to ear, while deep, dark cuts littered the skin of her face. Blood was dripping down onto her shirt, which was completely soaked now. It doesn't feel right, Norm. It has to be more. Just more. Hotter. More biting. I can feel the metal of the scalpel far too clearly. This isn't it. I can't. Her eyes were on him, and he felt the coldest chill of his life. She was staring at his face and grinning.
Annabelle, you need to calm down.
He managed to hiss, but instead of a response, he only saw her raising the scalpel until it pointed straight at him. I don't know if I can go back there. What if I don't? But I need to know. You need to help me. I'm sure Vince can fix you up again as well. Trust me. Norman cried out for help as he watched her advance on him with the scalpel in hand.
Annabelle, stop!
He screamed, but the look in her eyes told him that she didn't even hear him. He reached out for her arm, but the scalpel cut through the air and split open the palm of his hand. She wasn't laughing anymore, he realized, as his body shot around on instinct. The woman was completely silent. Hot pain shot up his arm as he tried to run for the small window. Norman screamed again and looked back. She was right there behind him, staring at him like a predator would. His fingers reached the handle of the window as he felt a cold breeze on his neck. A hand, slick with blood, grabbed him by the shoulder and drew him back. Norman screamed, then felt all the air leaving his lungs as something long and sharp stabbed his back. Hush now. It will all be over soon. Just remember what happened, so you can tell me later. The woman whispered into his ear. He could feel her heat on him, then the pain flooding through his body. The scalpel got turned around in his back as the woman dragged him away from the window. Norman tried to scream, but no sound was coming out of his throat. A hand clasped over his mouth and nose, and he could see her eyes in the almost darkness, still looking at him. It only felt like a moment had passed before Norman jumped up from the floor. Around him, all the lights had gone out. Not even the moon was shining anymore. But he knew where he was. The smell was the same. He called out, but got no answer. Only his own voice seemed to echo back from the walls in the darkness. Norman took a step, then suddenly felt it. Unimaginable pain as something split his back. He screamed and cried and started to run.